Sarah, thank you so much for such a good overview of the key themes in the book and the issues that it raises and seeks to address. And we're really lucky to have Liz Alden Wily here, not least because her train finally delivered her to us, but lucky to have her here because she is a contributor to the book, has for decades been working with governments and aid agencies and at a practical level, not only at a policy level, but at a practical level, trialling different approaches to land to resolutions to land-related challenges and so forth, and has a wealth of personal practical experience to bring to it and a great deal of authority. Liz is also an honorary fellow of the Rights and Resources Initiative, Global Natural Resource Consortium on Conservation institutions and so forth, and is busy herself writing a book, Who Owns Africa? Liz, tell us a little about your key themes. Have you found the answer yet?
Of course. It's governments. Okay, thank you. Oh, is this on? Yeah?
I think it is.
Can you hear me? I have a soft voice. Can you hear me?
Bring it a little closer.
All right. You can pass this one. Right. Thank you. Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Sarah. I'm probably one of those land tenure specialists that Sarah mentioned probably not sensitive enough to the direct humanitarian needs. But I think also what we're learning is the humanitarian community, because of the position it puts itself in, needs to be aware of what's happening in the land relations sector. And indeed, I could say needs to be aware of what some of us think is going to be a very war-torn century, rather like the last one, perhaps worse. So I don't take too much time. Let me first give you a quick synopsis of an argument that I'm going to give you on this. First, basically, Sarah has said there's a lot of focus on the immediate needs, tend towards the restitution of wrongfully occupied property, tends towards the knee-jerk reaction of the reconstruction community as to title, but the question arises, what are they titling? Are they further entrenching an undesirable situation? And what so often seems to be lacking is tackling of the fundamentals, the structural flaws, or what again Sarah referred to as the architecture of land relations in the country. And it's continuing. This failure is continuing. Even in, we're still getting it wrong, even when an effort has been made in peace agreements or in the reconstruction community begins to pay attention, we're still failing, and at great cost. And I'll give you some examples of that later. Now, there is really a rather simple source of the problem. And it's extremely common across agrarian states, and it's quite simply the status, the national law status, the statutory status of around 1 billion people in the world, in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. What is the legal status of their property rights, of their customary / indigenous, community-based, or other informal land rights? This is the kernel of the issue that comes up almost without exception in every agrarian state conflict. And I think, as we know, if you look at the conflicts, I did a quick tally when I was writing my chapter for Sarah's book. Only 11 out of the 70 conflicts in January 2008 were not in agrarian states. And 48% of all conflicts, including civil wars, were in Africa. And I think that's, there's a very good reason for this, which we'll come back to. My argument is that conflict is already increasing around this issue, and that we will continue to see it increase quite severely and quite starkly. frankly, we only need to look at the current so-called global land grab to see where this conflict is going to materialize and become. That event is already providing a strong trigger to a lot of contention between governments and their people over a very simple question: whose land is it? If things continue as they're continuing now, and of course we now have 20 million hectares have been leased by foreign companies and first world states, 10 million of which is in Africa. If this trend continues, we're going to have an even more pressured situation in which the rural majority in many of these countries are not only, in effect, tenants of state, or you could say squatters on their own land because of the lack of legal recognition of their rights, they may well be tenants of foreign corporate food-producing companies, producing food, by the way, not for the local market, but for their own economies back home. So they're right there, and I want to come back to this. We have a major driver of upcoming conflict in agrarian states, third world states, but particularly it's going to hit Africa, which is the main source of this land leasing. Now, again, very quickly, as I say, the issue itself is remarkably common among agrarian states. It's very much the lack of legal support given to customary land rights, particularly over any assets that they by tradition and very sensibly hold collectively as common property: woodlands, pasturelands, rangelands, so-called wastelands, which happen to be very mineral rich, forests and woodlands. These are the most vulnerable, but it's about 5 billion hectares around the world, this land, and often it is these areas, so-called unused lands, that are becoming the target, for example, of this current global land grab. If it's easy in principle to resolve the issue, it is obviously a lot less easy in practice, because it does require governments, it in effect requires a complete restructuring of the state, given that often agrarian governments in particular have become governments serving themselves rather than serving people, and it would require for these governments to surrender the landlordism that they have acquired, and of course where they were originally colonial states, where they inherited this idea that it is perfectly all right for the state to be the majority landholder in a country. Not the norm in industrial economies, certainly in agrarian states. Running in Africa anywhere between 60 and 95%. The 95%, by the way, is Sudan, of land that is legally belongs to the state. Therefore, how many million people are, as I say, tenants on these land? So we have a major issue coming up. It's already been a cause of a lot of civil wars and a cause of a lot of sub-civil war conflicts. Just overall, I think if the last century was a century in which the land task was, right from the Mexico Revolution in 1917 all the way through China, Russia, up to 56 states, were forced to address the distribution of feudal farmland from feudals to landless, often bonded tenants. Now that was, you know, if we give it a broad brush approach, that was the main issue of the 20th century. And of course it did not happen without revolutions, rebellions, and a lot of civil conflict, and a lot of required, rightly or wrongly, a lot of reconstruction of states, of which communism was one version. Helped that in China and the Soviet Union, and the 16 states affected by that. I think the point is land, unless you're an industrial economy, who owns the land is a critical issue, and people will go to war. They will fight about this, and as they begin to understand the dynamics of why their rights are denied, they become very articulate and able and willing to fight about it. Okay, redistribution of farmland last century. This century, I think we are going to see a redistribution of power and rights, basically between the state and people, and also the agents or the clients of the state often affects the intertribal balance in a country. We see this in Afghanistan, most Central Asian states. But unfortunately, I think at this stage, it looks like there will similarly, to reach that point by the end of the century, we will probably have to see and go through a lot of civil conflict. So that's basically the overall argument. Just, I want to elaborate on, I want to give you a couple of examples, Sudan and Afghanistan. And I've chosen these deliberately because, as I just said, these were cases where some attention was paid to the dynamics of this big, simple but complex question, who owns the resources? In Sudan, the assisting parties did manage to get al-Bashir to agree that in the agreement, and therefore in the interim constitution, that customary land rights would be addressed. We would have all liked a much stronger directive principles in there saying how they'd be addressed. Would they be awarded status in the modern world as private property rights? That was left open, unfortunately. Now, not only has the North failed to tackle that issue, it has proceeded to revisit exactly the manner of land allocations which drove the 24-year war in the first place in 1984, which, if I can remind you, was a law introduced to declare that all land in Sudan, the largest country in Africa, was government property unless it was registered. At that time, there were about 2 to 3% of the area was registered. So overnight, every rural Sudanese became, in effect, a tenant of the state. Now, instead of addressing this balance and doing what I will come to, what South Sudan has tried somehow to do, is to say, or follow the example of South Africa, Tanzania, and Uganda are prime examples in this, and Ghana, of saying, yes, we do recognize customary rights as property rights, whether they're registered or not, and they will be accorded the respect of property in the modern world. Instead of doing that, then we have an estimated 5 million hectares since March 2008 has been leased to 14, mainly Gulf states, but also China, also, I have a whole list here, Jordan and a few other places, on quite substantial lease terms. And all I need to ask you is, whose land is the state leasing, and what is going to happen with the evictions? We've already seen a lot of evictions. I was in Cameroon 2 weeks ago. There, for example, the Chinese who have just leased 10,000 hectares are going around. They hadn't realized the land was occupied or owned, so they have imported thousands of motorbikes and bicycles and are asking families to leave the land. So that they can make way for rice production. A small example, but very typical. So it all comes back down to this question. We talk about migration, we talk about people having to flee their countries. We may have a completely, in this coming 10, 20 years, a very different version of departure from your home. Afghanistan is an interesting and worrying case in a different way. After the Bonn Agreement, the reconstruction parties and the government was very strongly alerted to the fact that even though there were masses of issues about wrongful occupation, particularly affecting the urban and the middle class people who had property and who had seen it change hands for many times over their 20-year or so civil war. That an overfocus of that was ignoring the fact that out of the civil war had come a recapturing of territory by communities, the Hazara in particular, but also other non-Pashtun northern groups, of land that through conquest, British-assisted conquest, I might say, in the 1880s and 1890s, where the dominant Pashtun ethnicity had taken the land and handed it over to their own people, specifically to a group who were almost a majority at the time in the late 19th century, the nomadic pastoralists. Now, they were warned that failure to tackle this issue and to look again at whether, how land should be owned in the rural areas, and whether the state, which was claiming ownership of this massive resource, 60% of the land area, pasture resource, whether they should just go back to business or usual or examine it. It's been very slow and very problematic, and there has been a lack of donor investment. Ironically, it's often the humanitarian groups who are getting involved in this issue, not always with the expertise they need. The end result is, however, that because it's been allowed to sit, it is now, as of this last summer, opened up a whole new front of the war in Afghanistan. And those of us who work there call this the other war. It's a land war, and it has enormous capacity to propel the state, the whole nation, into another whole kind of war. The Taliban, for example, have rather cleverly decided to side with those of their own ethnicity, the Pashtun, and for the last 3 years in the trenches, on the edge of the pastures in the Hindu Kush, we are now seeing white Taliban flags. In response, the Hazara have quite openly said they will call upon the support of their Iranian brothers, Shia brothers. So we have a new front of the war, never reported on, I notice, in the British press, that really has the potential to engage the warring parties in a different way. We had a taste of it when the Taliban were able to take on a social agenda in Pakistan by suddenly realizing that Pakistan is one of the least reformed feudal economies, and that they sided with the landless tenants against the feudal landlords in the Swat Valley. It's no coincidence that many of those who have not returned are the wealthy landlords. So we, on top of everything else, we are opening up opportunities for insurgencies, movements to borrow, to piggyback on, and to gain tremendous authority and power by obtaining a social agenda. So these are the kind of worries that I think need to be looked at and which are really not being acted on enough. If I can just, Nick, quickly say a few more words about this, the so-called global land grab that is going on. Because there's obviously a lot of interest in this. There's, as I said, 20 million hectares in the last 18 months has been leased with the backing of state-to-state agreements, often on 3 pages, leasing 100,000 hectares of, as I say, land that is by law called public land, state land, national land, but in practice is the customary property of ordinary peasant communities. 10 million hectares of this, as I say, is in Africa, and this does not include the 8 million hectares which DRC has recently promised the South African Farmers Union to develop for their food crops. Now, there's a lot of talk about what's this doing to food security and whose food security. a lot of issues, environmental issues, a lot of issues about the press so far and international agencies, and I'm afraid I include both the World Bank and FAO in this, are focusing for the moment more on the issue of what does this do to customary use and occupancy rights. The reality is that we have to focus on a much deeper issue of whose land is this? And it's not their use and occupancy of state land that needs to be honored. It is now the reform in these rights, that these rights are recognized as private property rights, whether they're a farm right, a house right held by an individual family, or whether they're quite substantial collective rights over many, many thousands of hectares of lands, the only real assets of these communities. As I say, we're not talking about a small number of people. We're talking about 1 billion to 1.5 billion people in the world are afflicted by this exact issue. And we've already seen conflict after conflict over that. It doesn't help that over the last 6 months we've begun to see hedge funds, investment funds getting into the leasing of land in Africa, not for food security, but a hedge against inflation. Clearly food prices are going to go up. They're going to get in there with a little technology, with a little management. They can have low-level production on these lands, gain from the land, gain from the products. So we're heading into a very dangerous situation, I think, where we can expect a lot more civil conflict and really fodder for war.
Just 1 minute.
I think that's it. Okay, sorry. I think I'll stop there.
That's tremendous.
Because
That's tremendous. Thank you so much.
Thank you.